Welcome to another episode of the Fram Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Oren Hiskia and Shira Berger in honor of their upcoming marriage, B'Shal Tov U'Mutzlachas, may they be zeicha to build a bias Neman B'Yisrael. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please check out the link and information in the show's notes below or email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the many Zells and PayPals of support I've gotten over the past week since the 5-year episode is very much appreciated. Additionally, I got many emails and WhatsApps, thank you notes, and very kind words from many listeners, so I do appreciate that as well. And as always, please send any and all feedback via email, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can WhatsApp me if you're on the chat. Speaking of which, you can find the link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Fram Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new forum book deals, and so on. Also, if you can please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, Apple, 24/6, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Fram Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Edward Fram, who is Professor of Jewish History at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, and we'll be discussing a book that he wrote a number of years ago, book and a translation titled My Dear Daughter, Rabbi Binyomin Slonik and the Education of Jewish Women in 16th Century Poland. And this is about Rabbi Binyomin Slonik, who listeners may be more familiar with him as the author of Shalos Teshuvas Masas Binyamin, as well as this work, that Seder, Mitzvos, Nashim. It was originally written in Yiddish, and it deals with the 3 mitzvahs of women, Chala, Nida, Adlakas Haner, lighting candles Friday night, and it was written in Yiddish. And this edition, Professor Fram, has the Yiddish text with the English translation, and there's also more recently been a Hebrew translation through Zichron Aaron, and then that was published as a standalone, and now it's combined in the back of their new edition of his Teshuvas Masas Binyamin. But we'll be discussing this Professor Fram's translation and his kind of overview and discussion of the book. So thank you, Professor Fram, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off, as I mentioned, what the Sefer is about, the Mitzvos for Women. How did you become interested in Rabbi Slonik and really in this Sefer of his?
So I had an interest before I worked on this on the poskim who lived in Poland between about 1550 and 1650. That more or less stretches from the end of Rav Shalom Shachna's life until the Shach. But all those people really wrote for a certain level of audience. They wrote for people who could read Rabbinic Hebrew, and certainly their Sheilot v'Tshuvot, not even to speak of their commentaries on the Tur and Shulchan Aruch, were really for the highest level of learners. But there was another part of Polish Jewry that hadn't been addressed, and those were people who didn't have that level of education. And Rav Binyomin Slonik made an attempt to deal with them in the realm of halacha. There were certainly other books that were addressed to them in Yiddish. There were translations, even translations of Rashi and Chumash. There were translations of Chumash. There were translations of certain books of Tanakh. There were certain ethical books that were written as well. But a halachic book aimed at these people, that was something that wasn't too common. There were others, but that wasn't common. And someone of Rabbi Binyomin Slonik's standing to write a book like this, that was certainly uncommon. So that was my interest. How did he present the law to the lay people?
Yeah, because that's essentially what it is. It's I forget what you call it, a guidebook or something. It's more it's not like a code book. It's more for the lay people, directed in the vernacular, which is Yiddish, and really written for them. So before that, I think we should discuss a little bit Rabbi Binyomin Slonik's bio. It's not something you do in the book, really. And the book, I think I said this, but just to clarify, it's a kind of 2 parts. The first part is kind of like 150, 160 pages. Basically, its own book discussing the background, the context of the time of the other writings, and the background and context of the Sefer. And then the second part is the bilingual Yiddish-English edition of the book of Seder Mitzvos Nashim. But Rabbi Binyomin Slonik's bio is, you referred me to this book, so thank you for that. Authority and Community, Polish Jewry in the 16th Century by Nissen Shulman. It was published by Ktav. I think it's available used. That's where I got it. And so it is discussed in there. But let's talk about him a little bit. I think it'll help listeners understand someone that lives in the 16th century. I think it's Talmud Marshal, but I'll let you talk about him, when he's born, who he learns by, his background.
So Rabbi Binyomin Slonik seems to be a native of someplace in Lithuania, and eventually he'll become a Talmud both of Rav Moshe Isserles and Rav Shlomo Luria. So that alone makes him interesting. He's a Talmud of two people who have very different methodologies. And he represents, in many ways, a melding of these methodologies. But the book itself, in other words, Sefer Mitzvot Nashim, the biography of the man is less important because he hadn't become yet what he would become. So this whole thing is written while he's still a young man. And he's probably in his late 20s when he writes this. But later he will go on to become certainly one of the leading rabbis of Poland in the early 17th century. And his tshuvas certainly are still used to this day. He seems to peter out by around 1620. And the reason I say peter out, I don't think he dies in 1620, but the last tshuva written is around 1620. And we know from a famous tshuva that he wrote about, can a blind man have an aliyah? And he was going blind. So I don't think it was just a hypothetical question for him. It really affected him very much. And I assume that his health was deteriorating, and that's sort of why we lose track of him after 1620. We don't know the exact date of his death, but that's the last we know of him in terms of his scholarship.
So, we can just leave his bio really there. As you say, for your book and for purposes mainly of this discussion, it's not so important because he wrote it when he was younger, which is in and of itself something we'll discuss. But it is just worth mentioning who he was. Also, he has a son. I believe his son writes a super commentary on Rashi.
Right.
Nachas Binyomin, is that the name of it?
Right. And that's, if one purchases one of those multi-volume or multi-commentary works on Rashi that have the Mizrahi and Siftei Chachamim, so usually that's to be found there as well.
Yeah, I have a separate, I think one of the Coopermans did a 3-volume with there was notes and a commentary on the commentary, but that's his son. Okay, so something that you mentioned was he was in his 20s when he writes this book. So in and of itself, it's very interesting because he's writing something for the lay people and mainly for women at that. And then he's young. I mean, how unique is it on both those ends for a rabbi, even though he's a young rav at the time, to write something directed toward the lay people, and let's just, specifically women, and the fact that a rav at all is writing something geared towards lay people and women.
So let's go back a little bit into the 15th century. And in the 15th century was a whole debate, should Yiddish books, halachic books, be written for the laity? The Ma'aril, Rav Yaakov Molin, was very much opposed to writing halachic books for the laity in the vernacular. He believed that people who had questions should come to a Rav and ask, or go to shiurim and learn, but basically knowledge should always be mediated through someone who is knowledgeable. So he was very much against it. But there were Yiddish works. When we say Yiddish, really it's Judeo-German. It's not modern Yiddish. It's very close to German, but we'll call it Yiddish because that's certainly what it's generally called, just in modern parlance. But people would write shechita books, how to do ritual slaughtering, so people would know how to do that because not every shochet knew how to do that. So you get these books written. But we don't have books written in Yiddish by people who would attain the level of Rabbi Binyomin Slonik. That's very unusual. There were books on Hilchot Nida, on the laws of Nida before this. There were books on, as I said, Shechita. There are a few halachic books in Yiddish, but not at this level. And so that's really what's very unusual.
Just in general, a question about the book. I mentioned it was geared towards lay people and women. Was it geared specifically to women, or was it also meant for lay men who didn't know these halachas to be able to tell their wives?
So it's an interesting question whether men were supposed to tell their wives. Certainly that was an older assumption before the advent of printing, that men would often have to educate their wives. They weren't the only source of education. Certainly women could educate other women. But the main audience of Rabbi Binyomin Slonik book is certainly women. But it doesn't exclude men also who could also share these halachas with their wives. One has to question how many people were literate. not every Jewish person, male or female, was literate. So you could have a situation where you had a male who was literate, and he could read it and then explain it to his wife.
So why did Rabbi Binyomin Slonik write this? I mean, like we said, he was very young. This is the first book that he writes, I believe. And he's writing a book in the vernacular, let's call it, as you said, we'll call it Yiddish, for women. A guidebook to give them, basic halachas of what they should be doing day to day. Why does he do that?
Well, one would have to assume that there was a lacuna in people's knowledge, or he felt there was, that people didn't know. And that cuts two ways. And he mentions there are women who don't know what to do. So they don't know what to do, so they make mistakes. But those mistakes could either be to take on extra stringencies or to take on leniencies. And he is trying to fill in this and try to, particularly with people who live outside communities where there is no Rav. A printed book, can help fill in that missing source of knowledge. And I think that that may be part of it. I think another part is he wants people to spend their time learning and not wasting it reading novels. This is the age of print. And as we all know, print has many things, including novels that are that people want to read, right? All you have to do is look at the New York Times bestseller list. Some of the novels are novels you wouldn't want your children reading or your wives reading. And so he tries to fill this in, and he tries to make this book a good read, which is a topic maybe we'll come back to. But in so doing, this helps with the religious life of these people who have the ability to read, want to read, or are basically have access to books. Read this book instead of some novel. And the novel need not be a novel about Jewish subjects, right? There are all sorts of trashy novels in German that people can read. So this is an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, there were Jewish ones, the Bava Buch, the Maisa Buch. You have,
right.
things.
But you also have Dietrich von Bern, right? Dietrich von Bern is really not a Jewish book. So the Maisa Buch and the Bava Buch are all attempts to try to make it more Jewish. But there are all those non-Jewish books out there too.
For sure. And so talking about non-Jewish things, is this phenomenon, you mentioned there were some others before him, but it's kind of newish. And is this common in the Christian world? Were Christians doing the same type of thing, writing these guidebooks or handbooks for the laity, or?
So the how-to book is something that's permeates the 16th century. Now, the how-to book can have all sorts of permutations. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious. There are all sorts of things. If you go into a bookstore today, you'll find that how-to books are probably amongst the best sellers, and that was true then too. There was a professor who taught in Rutgers University named Rudolph Bell, who wrote a book called How to Do It, and it was about the proliferation of these books in the 16th century, about everything, how to cook, how to do everything, but not necessarily how to observe halacha, right? So Christians don't necessarily have that. For Protestants, of course, printing was crucial in the whole Reformation. Luther understood the power of print, and he used it very, very effectively. But he wasn't writing books on telling people how to observe the details of law, because for Protestants that was far less important. For Catholics would have been using, ideally, priests would have been educating people. But halacha, so to speak, or canon law is not something that would have had a popular book. So in that sense, this is a Jewish phenomenon, but of course the use of print is in no which way a Jewish phenomenon.
Let me just take a pause for a second and ask you a clarification question, because I've mentioned a bunch of time a guidebook or as a handbook. I think you really call it a handbook. What does that mean to the listener? Someone opening it today, the Hebrew edition or your edition, would see it's like kind of like a halacha sefer. So what does that mean when we compare it, especially to kind of a code book or a classic, quote unquote, halacha book like a Shulchan Aruch or something like that?
So Shulchan Aruch has certain things, or if you don't like Shulchan Aruch, even if you want something more popular like Chayei Adam or Chochmat Adam, these books tend to have a number of possibilities. If you read Shulchan Aruch, there's often in any given siman, there are a number of possibilities. The Mechaber says, Yesh Omrim. Or the Ramah will say sometimes that these are the customs in these places, but in other places there may be different customs. There are different possibilities. And that's something you don't see very much of in Slonik's book. If you're writing a handbook, you don't want to tell people there's this opinion and there's that opinion. You could do this or you could do that. Slonik tends to tell people what they should do. Moreover, it's restricted to just 3 topics. Right? You have the laws of Nida, you have the laws of taking challah, and you have the laws of lighting candles. The other books tend to be much, much larger. And in that sense, there's something quite unique in Slonik's book that you won't find in a code, and that's the use of stories. He includes many stories, midrashim, to try to convince people to observe the law correctly. Shulchan Aruch doesn't bother to do that. A code is, the assumption is the user of the code is someone who's learned and is totally accepting the system. That's not Slonik's case. Slonik is trying to convince people why they should observe the law correctly.
So he writes this book, as I said, in Yiddish, directed at women, directed at the lady, and it's more of a guidebook, a handbook, rather than a legal code and something like that. You said there were some others. I mean, is there something unique about the style that he chose, or is this more patterned on such books in the Christian world and the Jewish world before him, and he's just picking it up and approaching these 3 mitzvahs, so these topics specifically?
So there were other books on these 3 topics that were written before. We have both in manuscript and in print. We have a manuscript from the very, very early 16th century. We have one of the first books printed in Eastern Europe was called Azharat Nashim, which was again a book about these topics. But Slonik did something that nobody had done before in these realms, and that is that he includes these stories as part of his guidebook. These attempts to convince people through stories about whether it be David HaMelech or whether it be other stories based on Midrashim or Rabbanim from the Gemara. He includes that as part of the halachic presentation. And that's something that's unique. The Shechita books that we have in Yiddish tell you the halachas of Shechita. They don't try to convince you to do Shechita properly. They just tell you these are the laws. Slonik is unique in that his presentation is really aimed at a lay audience that may not be fully committed. And he tries to bring about that commitment.
So I think that's something that we really should discuss now. It's something you do discuss in it's not an intro, it's like your first half of the book. What are the lives of Jewish women at the time like, just in general? And then, which goes hand in hand with what their halachic observance is and what we know of that.
So clearly there are Jewish women who are very committed. Right? We know of women in the late 16th century, early 17th century. We have some examples of well-educated women. We even have one woman who wrote a book in Yiddish for other women, and Rivka of Tiktin, which was translated some years ago into English and is available in English. So we have such examples. We know that the wife of Rabbi Yoshua Falk used to sit at the table together with the boys in the yeshiva, and she would talk Torah with them. She would give divrei Torah. That was part of her daily life. But those women are really exceptions. For most women, their lives were very much focused around the house. That doesn't mean that they didn't have anything outside of the house. But women who were married basically spent their lives taking care of the home. Now, in an age without dishwashers, washing machines, refrigeration, and all those things, you can imagine it's a whole lot more time-consuming daily life. Take Pampers away, then what have you got? That's a lot of time that you have to spend cleaning up. And that's something the women did. That doesn't mean they didn't participate in trade. If the husband had a business, could be that she had a hand in the business. If a woman was a widow, it's a totally different game, because a widow had to take care of herself. She may have to run the business. She may have to do many, many things outside of the home. But in most cases, at least the general picture is that women would be at home. So that didn't leave them any time to go study. They weren't educated. They didn't receive formal education. If in 1551 the community of Krakow made sure that every young man, every boy, had a basic education, even those who couldn't afford a tutor, the community provided a Talmud Torah for them, that wasn't true of women. Women didn't get that opportunity. If they were going to learn how to read Hebrew characters, either their father would teach them, maybe their brother would teach them, maybe their mother would teach them, but unless they were from a wealthy family, they're unlikely to have had a tutor. There were no schools for them. Beis Yaakov is still hundreds of years away. So that's just not a possibility. And there were books that were aimed at these women to try to educate them. Of course, the most famous and most successful was the early 17th century, the Tzenu Arena. Right? That is an attempt to try to educate women, and that became, if you like, a woman's Bible. But that's because for most of these women, Shabbos is a time they can, if they have an opportunity to sit and read, and they can read, and they have a book, Shabbos would most likely be the time. Remember also, no electricity. So you're not likely to spend your evening sitting reading.
And the Tenorena is now there's English translation. I did a podcast a while back with Morris Fairstein about his translation to English. Also, you mentioned Bishua Falk, who is the author of the Sma, the Prisha, the Drisha. Listeners most probably familiar with him and his works. But one more question generally about the woman. So what's the attitude like? And this could be, from a Christian or a Jewish perspective towards women in the 16th century.
So in general, I think that women are second-class citizens, right? Their role is to serve within the family, but religiously their role is to serve men. If we think of rules of modesty, the rules of modesty are generally presented as a woman has to guard herself from enticing a man. All those things mean that the man is at the center. It's not the woman who is an equal partner. And because of that, since the woman is a secondary character in many ways, so her need to observe the laws of Nida are not only about her spiritual welfare, but her husband's spiritual welfare. And a number of places in the book, Slonik does mention how important a woman's place is in trying to make sure that her husband's spiritual life is richer. So the women are not in the place they are in 2023. And therefore there's a need to address that. And Slonik I think that's very much his frame of reference. His frame of reference is that women are not the equals of men. There are things he won't present them. Women are not capable of understanding. Whether women were capable of understanding or not, his perception is that they're not capable of understanding. So I think we have to understand that he sees them as being at least one notch below men, maybe more.
And is that a perception that we see as well in the writings of his Rebbeim, the Marshal, the Ramah, and other Polish, Rabbanim of his time or contemporary of him, or not, I shouldn't even say Polish, any Rabbanim of the time, European Rabbanim, wherever?
So when you say European, so let's talk for a moment about the non-Jewish society, then we'll come back to the Rabbanim. Certainly Christians viewed women in the same way. The Jewish view is in no way different. Christians viewed women also as being, again, a lower class than men. But in terms of other Rabbanim at the same time, this question comes up. Can you trust, for example, this comes up in Yoredea, can you trust women to check for worms in fish? Right? Sometimes, particularly in small fish, true to this day, even in the United States, right? You can find worms in fish. And if you don't check your fish, you may find that you're eating worms, and this was known in the 16th century. Oh, can you rely on women to do this? That's a debate that took place between the Marshal and the Ramah, whether you can rely on women to take care of these things. So there were some who thought that, no, you can't rely. Women are not punctilious enough. They don't have the concentration or the concern to do these sort of tiring things, and others thought they did. So, but I think this is pretty much universally accepted that women are not of the same level of men. Obviously, it's a big generalization, but I think it's one that holds.
Yeah, and that's what, that's something that you really see in the Seder Mitzvos Nashim, and you see, like you're saying, in other Sfarim. And so he writes this sefer geared towards them. Now, we already discussed what the difference is between this kind of handbook, guidebook, as opposed to like a classical code book like Shulchan Aruch, or certainly like Yam Shel Shleima, but others. But what is the impact of the other code books on Seder Mitzvos Nashim? Just looking at it, it's obviously, like you said, it's really, it brings down stories and midrashim, and it gives you just a psak. It says, this is what you do. It's no two opinions, and you have to parse out what you should do, which you should follow. It's kind of straightforward. But that being said, when you dive into the book, which is what you did, you can see things on there. The impact of the Shulchan Aruch, the impact of Ramah, and others. And I don't know if you have examples of that, or you could explain more how you see that from Seder Mitzvos Nashim.
So there are a couple of things that do appear here. So first of all, in terms of his sources, there were other books for women on these topics that had been published, and Slonik had access to them, and he used them. So that's one source that he had. But he uses Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was first published in 1565, and then the Ramah's notes on Hilchot Nida were first published in the fall of 1569, not as Shulchan Aruch, but rather as a little addendum to the Ramah's Torat Chatat. So if you have a first edition of the 1569 edition of Torat Chatat, in the back, there's a section of Hilchot Nida. Now, why this was published, why the Ramah wrote and published this section of Hilchot Nida before any other section of Shulchan Aruch, is in itself an interesting question, and goes back to probably two issues. One is Shari Dura, which the Torat Chatat is sort of a follow-up on, often included Hilchot Nida, so readers might have expected to find Hilchot Nida and Shari Dura. And the other seems to be a question regarding to the publisher. If you're thinking of investing in this whole business of Shulchan Aruch with the Ramah and the Mechaber, this is no small investment. So you might decide to put out a little test section to see, how do people react to this? Do they want it? They not want it? They just say, who needs this? Apparently people seem to like it. So Shulchan Aruch got published in Krakow not too long after. But Slonik has access to this, and Slonik copies word for word sections of Shulchan Aruch. That being said, he doesn't copy blindly. Moreover, since he had studied with both the Ramah and Rav Shlomo Luria, he also was aware that there were differences of opinions between them, and no less important, difference in methodology between them. And Slonik sees himself, I think, primarily as a student of the Marshal. And that means that he has halachic independence. He's willing to consider things, and he doesn't give you all the background for it here. But he's willing to consider things and come to independent conclusions. So, for a few examples, he rejected certain customs about how a woman should prepare her nails on Chol HaMoed. On Chol HaMoed, there's a question, can you cut your nails in the same way you do on the rest of the year, or do you have to do it differently? So there are a number of opinions, and he rejected the common custom. Should you say a bracha when you light candles on Yom Kippur? Should a woman say a bracha before? We have, at least the customs that I'm familiar with, they say a special bracha when lighting candles on Erev Yom Kippur. So here too, Slonik has his own opinion. Question, can you consummate a marriage on Shabbos? There too, Slonik follows Luria against Isserlis and against the custom. So he has these things that he thinks about things. He has his own opinions. He's not afraid to express them, even at the ripe old age of 20-something. He's still just thinking independently. And I think that's an important aspect of this book. He's not copying blindly, but he does copy from Shulchan Aruch, and there are things in Shulchan Aruch that are not in handbooks that came before Slonik. So, for example, one issue is what happens if one of the couple is sick. Can a woman who's in nida either be helped by her husband, or can she help her husband who is in need of help because he's sick? That's not included in the earlier handbooks, but it is included in Shulchan Aruch, and it finds its way here in Slonik's book as well. So these are things that he includes. There are some things that are in Shulchan Aruch that he doesn't even bother including here, because they simply are not things he wants to leave to the hands of the laity. And that's true even to this day. You know that, I don't have to tell you or your listeners, Art Scroll has published many handbooks in these matters as well, right? Slonik wasn't the first and he wasn't the last, and certainly Art Scroll wasn't the first, and probably not the last either. But one issue that they don't discuss is what the colors of blood render a woman unclean. And that's something they're not... First of all, how are you going to explain this in print? Is this yellow? Is this green? What yellow? What green? That's something that even Slonik says you have to go to a rabbi and ask about. Now in Shulchan Aruch there is discussion of this, but that's a hard thing to present to the public in Yiddish, and Slonik doesn't go there. So there is a limit there as well.
So about the difference you mentioned there between the Marshal and the Ramah, I'll refer listeners to your newer book, as well as our discussion about it, which is The Codification of Jewish Law on the Cusp of Modernity, which is a bit pricey. Still waiting for the paperback on that. But I will refer listeners to that, an excellent book, and we had a very nice conversation for listeners who want to see more about that and the differences there. So, as you mentioned the Shulchan Aruch, and of course, I'm sure we didn't mention the Torah and the Rambam and other classical works of Rishonim that come into play in Seder Mitzvos Nashim, anyone writing a halacha book. And so the Shulchan Aruch, as you mentioned, is printed in 1565, then 1569 the Rambam, and then later Seder Mitzvos Nashim, I believe, is printed in 1585. So
it's the second edition already. So 1577 is the first edition.
Is the first. So it's printed pretty early, pretty quickly after, and like you said, he was young. So when we see, well, let me actually go back to there. I mentioned the Torah and the Rambam and others. What impact do they have? Is it mainly Shulchan Aruch, Ramah, Marshal? Is he tied into those, or do you see him pulling sources from more classical, older works of Rishonim?
So he pulls from Yitzchak of Tirna, Rabbi Isaac of Tirna. He pulls from there a little bit, and he uses, as I said, the earlier handbooks that have been printed on this topic. But we don't really get big discussions about the opinions of the Rambam or the two or others, except, interestingly enough, in the case of how long must a woman wait after childbirth before going to mikveh. So there's this question about, it appears in the Torah, of pure blood. That is to say, after the birth of a boy or a girl, depends, 7 days or 14 days, but then there's a period that even if she sees blood, according to the Torah, that blood's considered dam tohar, it's pure blood. And that custom changed over time probably because of confusion. And Slonik relates to it. And he says one should not follow this 40 or 80 day period. And he says, because the Karaites do. Now, this may well be a reference to something that appears in the Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam also seems to be referring to the Karaites. Even though he speaks of Stukim, it's generally assumed that he was really speaking about Karaites. So it seems that Slonik looked at the Rambam, knew the Rambam, but the Rambam is not the big source for him, because the Rambam doesn't represent Ashkenazic customs. He represents a different cultural world. And the Tur also, since he doesn't bring other opinions, he just gives his final line. Generally, I found that he follows Shulchan Aruch, the earlier books on the topic, Rama, Marshal, but he's not going back and doing a whole reworking of all the Rishonim. And I should only add that in 1577, a young man, even if he was in Krakow, one has to consider what sort of library he would have of all these things. The Beit Yosef was a very important repository of all these Shitot of Rishonim. And one would assume he had the Tur and he'd have the Mordechai, but there are all sorts of opinions he doesn't have. If you're writing a book for women, I think that he focuses mainly on the practical books that are in his hands, and those are the previous books on the topic in Shulchan Aruch.
How about his chumro or mekel? Is the book stringent or is it lenient?
I think that it's a combination of both. I don't think he has a line, so to speak, that he follows. The whole point of the book is he doesn't want women to be stringent without any basis. Because stringency without basis is, I will say in his view, is a negative. Why is it a negative? Because if the purpose of copulation is to have children, then if you say to people, I'm going to take this stringency and that stringency, then you're preventing that from happening. And I don't think he's not interested in that. There are certain things that he is makel on. So one example is, and this is his own opinion, I don't know that anyone else has this opinion, can a woman wash herself? A hefsek tar, I'll just give us a quick explanation. When a woman is finished bleeding after her menstrual periods, she has to say, to show that she's stopped bleeding and there's no longer continuation of blood. So an internal examination is done, and to show that there is no more bleeding. But ideally, she has to wash herself before doing that. Well, what happens if that comes out on Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur? So the Rama says, okay, you don't have to wash yourself. But Prof. Slonik says she should wash herself. You say, but you're not allowed to wash yourself on Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av. He says, no, you can. Why? And this he writes in a tshuva. He says the reason is because the only washing that's prohibited is washing that has some sort of pleasure involved. This is not pleasure, this is necessity. So he goes off here in his own independent way. And that you would say, my goodness, look at that leniency. But he thinks that's the nature of the law, so he does it. But I don't see him as being dogmatic in terms of one way or the other. He has some things that he's more stringent on and other things that he's not. I don't think that there's a line that one can say represents his book.
Something else that you bring up in the book, that he also gives logical explanations for things, which is interesting and unique. You bring an example in 47, Mem Zayin, he says a woman getting ready to go to the mikvah for immersion, she should not use cold lye soap, shouldn't use soap as shampoo because it can make her hair become tangled. And he gives the explanation. He doesn't just give you, don't do that. He says, this is why you shouldn't do that. He says, don't use certain fuel in lighting, lamps, lighting candles on Shabbos. Why? Because they give an unpleasant odor. So he actually explains things, which I think goes back to what we were saying earlier. You see it's kind of a handbook, and he's speaking directly to the lady and trying to encourage their observance of certain things and kind of explain it, as opposed to when you open a Shulchan Aruch, he's not necessarily going to tell you, this is why you should do it or shouldn't do this.
So I think you're right about Shulchan Aruch, that the Mechaber in particular doesn't tell you why. The Rama sometimes does. Right? The Rama will give a reason, a logical reason or a textual reason why, but generally the Mechaber does not. And I think that Slonik follows here his teacher, and when possible, if he has a logical explanation, he'll use it, because that encourages observance. But he doesn't give an explanation. Well, there's a debate between the Baal HaTur and the Or Zarur on something, just to throw out a possibility. He doesn't say that we follow this rabbi over that rabbi. He doesn't get into the halachic discussions that are involved. That's not for his audience.
Yeah, he also explains if a woman finds a of blood on the bed sheets, then she can attribute it to a bed bug and say, oh, if there's bugs there that are common there, that's another thing that we would think about like as a leniency.
Well, we're also not as common, except in Paris nowadays, but bed bugs are just not as common as they once were. But in the world they lived in, that may have been far more common. But yes, he's willing to do that. He's willing to use these leniencies.
Yeah, he definitely is. No, you mentioned the tshuva of his. So he writes his tshuvas later, once he becomes a big household name, a big Rav in Europe. So do we see him backtracking from Seder Mitzvos Nashim, changing his position, explaining things? What impact do his... This is a question that occurs with many, Machabri Sfarim. You have this with the Rush, you have this with Rajbi, you have many others, but specifically to him, he writes this Seder Mitzvos Nashim, this practical handbook when he's much younger, and then we see his tshuvas and more developed later. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? You get to see the development of someone's thinking. And that's really one of the interesting things here. Here you have the young man writing. And during the course of his life, when he writes tshuvas, he goes back and he revisits some of these things. However, the tshuva, or at least some of his tshuvas, certainly not all, I'm not making a generalization, but there are tshuvas of his that might be tshuvas in the sense that there's a question and an answer, but it might not be that somebody asked him the question, but rather reminiscent of the Truma Tedeshin. These are more rabbinic essays. Rabbinic essays as a genre hadn't developed yet. And so sometimes rabbis would write themselves a question and then answer it. And his thought develops. Some things, such as the washing on Yom Kippur, he stands by and explains in a tshuva, and other things, his thought seems to develop and change. And one other question we always have to consider is that in a handbook, one can write in generalities, but in a real question, one has to consider the people involved as well. The circumstances of the question may push towards a certain type of answer, and that's something we don't always know. But yes, he does go back and he revisits, and it gives us a chance to look how this man's thinking develops. But one thing that remains true throughout his life, and just add as a footnote, the tshuvas in the Masat Binyomin are generally, not always, but generally chronological. They follow the order, basically, of their writing. And so it gives us a chance to see how the man thinks and how his thinking changes over time.
We mentioned a number of examples from Hilchos Nida, but he also discusses Chala and Hadlakas Haner. Is that just because Nida is the most important part of the book, or are there other interesting or important parts from the other two topics in the book?
So there are other important parts in the other two topics of the book, particularly what happens when Jews don't have a Jewish bakery on hand, and therefore the bread is essentially prepared by a non-Jewish baker, but the Jewish woman wants to take challah from the bread. So what did they do? They went to the baker who had already prepared the dough, took the dough from him, took challah from him, and then brought it back to the baker for baking. That's an unnecessary step, since the dough became obligated in challah when it was in the hands of and possession of a non-Jew, and that was incorrect of them to do. So he discusses that. So we learn a little bit about some of the issues that went on in that time. But the difference between challah and hadlakat nerot and nida comes with a very severe sanction. The woman who doesn't observe, and the man doesn't observe the laws of nida properly, has the punishment of karet, which is the same as eating on Yom Kippur. That's pretty severe. Hadlakat haner is something that's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, not belittling it, but certainly not at the same level. And hafrashat challah, certainly in the post-temple period, the challah is ultimately just going to be burned anyways. So while it's certainly important, it's not necessarily not something that every woman did. So he goes through all the rules, he tells you how it should be done, he explains how much dough you have to have, and does so very clearly in an age when they don't have how many quarts or liters or whatever you need of the measurement. He explains very clearly how to do all this, what types of grains require this, flour require this. but it doesn't have the same depth and the same intricacies as the discussion of Nida does.
So do we know why he focused on these three mitzvahs specifically? Or is that just... Go ahead.
That's part of the tradition of these books, right? The three mitzvot Chana, usually called Chet Nun He, Chala, Nida, Hadlakat Haner. And there was a tradition that already existed in Ashkenazic societies to discuss these three mitzvahs together for women. And so he follows in that genre.
So he prints the first one in 1577. It's kind of Yiddish, or we'll call it Yiddish. And then there is another edition. There's also an Italian edition printed shortly thereafter.
Yeah, there is. The beginning of the 17th century, Yaakov Halpern was an Ashkenazic Jew living in northern Italy. He gets a copy of Slonik's book, and he adapts it for Italian readers. And originally, he wrote it seems in Hebrew characters, Judeo-Italian. That is to say, a mix of both of Italian and some Hebrew, in Hebrew characters. But ultimately, when it was printed in Italian, with Hebrew words mixed in here and there. And he's writing for an Ashkenazic audience that's living in northern Italy. And there was a major Ashkenazic community in northern Italy that's dying out by the beginning of the 17th century. Dying out in the sense that they're simply being acculturated into Italian culture. They had been there since the late 14th century. Ashkenazic Jews had moved to Italy, right? Italy had a lot of economic possibilities, and German Jews moved there. Rabbi Yehuda Mintz eventually moved there, and northern Italy was, in the year 1500, arguably the major center of Ashkenazic Jewry. It's only in the second half of the 16th century that Poland takes over. So those Jews who remained there, Halpern is one of those people who tries to continue this. He also writes a book on how to salt the meat, to kasher it. Also in Yiddish, explaining, he says Ashkenazic women don't seem to know all the rules, so he's going to write this. But that he writes this book in Italian rather than in Yiddish is an interesting statement about where the linguistic comfort zone of Ashkenazic Jews in northern Italy was in the early 17th century.
What impact does Seder Mitzvos Nashim this book have, at that time, and then subsequently in later generations, whether that's on the laity or also in Sfarim? Do we see it quoted brought down in other Sfarim?
So I can't tell you that I've looked at every single Sefer, but this is not a book that really has a lot of echoes in other learned books. It's just not a book. Yiddish books written for the laity were not books that Rabbanim sat and read, and it doesn't get cited, whereas his tshuvas are cited extensively. So it's not him, the person, that's the issue. It seems to be the genre that is not being used. That cuts both ways. You will find in the Shach sometimes where he may complain about Yiddish works. If I remember in the Shach, could be in the Taz, that I don't remember, but they'll complain about Yiddish works being published either for Shochtim or other such popular works. There are mistakes there. I don't remember everyone ever saying there's a mistake in Rabbi Binyomin Slonik's book. It doesn't have to be corrected. But in terms of long term, it gets republished again in the 17th century, but eventually it sort of fades out. And even in its own time, it's not clear whether people changed their customs based on the book. We know that the Bach talks about a custom that was in Krakow. Here was the place where this book was published. The custom is not as Rabbi Binyomin Slonik wrote. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say.
Now, as I mentioned, the book that you printed has two parts. The first is some of what we discussed. There's some more historical contextualization and other parts of the book. They talk about different editions, etc. But then the second part is a translation. You have the Yiddish on one side and you have the English translation on the other side. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know, have you done other translating jobs, and what was that process like? Because that's a whole different thing than writing a book. That's translating and getting the translation down and the sources and, the source part too. But what was the translation work like?
So I have to say, I worked together with someone who had far better Yiddish or Old Yiddish than I have, and that was Agnes Romer Segel. And Agnes and I worked together on that translation. And part of it was getting used to the style of the late 16th century, and also the difference between Eastern Yiddish and Western Yiddish. There are words in Western Yiddish that are not used in the East, and there were words used in the East not used in the West. Some of the things even just have to do with food words, right? These earlier books talked about different types of pasta. Well, that's because they may have been written for an Italian Ashkenazic. When you move to the East, who's going to talk about pasta? You're going to talk about pierogi. So you get those sort of changes. But those are just food words. There are other words. There's even a Russian word or a Slavic word in this book that seems to get picked up. There's a whole question, what do you put on the bottom of a mikveh? If you think of a mikveh nowadays is more often than not, at least in North America, is a rather nice building, and it's clean and everything is taken care of. But in Eastern Europe, and certainly in Western Europe too, it wasn't always the case. They used to dig down to groundwater. And if you visit the mikvahs that remain, either in, for example, in Friedberg or in Speyer and these places, if you go down, it's pretty muddy down there. And that's because you've gone to groundwater. So can you put something down? Can you cover it? So there's a word there that's even in Russian. So there are things that are adapted. But Slonik had to take all these things into consideration. It was his audience and what they do, what they were doing. And I think that in the sense of how he presents his book and how he tries to think of his audience and who he's trying to influence, I think that he's writing for people in Eastern Europe, but based upon works that had come from before.
So there's your book, if anyone is interested. And I think I'll put a link, but I think it's somewhat available, maybe used. I'm not sure if it's available in print brand new anymore. But then, like I mentioned, Zichron Aaron now did a new Hebrew edition. So that's a red cover. It's kind of a standalone. And I don't know that that's around either anymore. I know that their edition of his Chuvas Masas Binyomin is definitely around. And they put the Seder Mitzvos Nashim in the back. So it's like this big book now. And you have both. And maybe their standalone Seder Mitzvos Nashim is available. Are you familiar with their Hebrew edition? And what do you have to say about that work?
So I have a copy of a Hebrew edition here on my shelf. I do. And I assigned to my students here in Israel, so of course it's much easier for them to read than to read the Yiddish, which is difficult for them. So I do use it, and I will be honest and say that I did not go through the entire Hebrew translation to see what I think in terms of the Yiddish. The Slonik book is one book that I did translate from Yiddish. I've translated other passages from Yiddish, but I have not attempted to try, or nor do I think I will try to redo an entire book again in Yiddish, but the Hebrew certainly serves an audience, and that's important.
Okay. So just as a final point here, why would you say that someone today should read it? I mean, obviously it's a sefer, it's a halacha work, but does it still... does it still serve a purpose? I don't mean that. The point is you can still learn so many other things. Practical halacha today, the halachas, you have more contemporary poskim, etc. Should someone still read it, other than historically looking through, if there's halacha that comes up there or something like that, but just to actually read the sefer today?
So let's leave aside the question, do you have to deal with all the poskim who came from the time of Rabbi Binyomin Slonik until today? Let's leave that aside. Let's assume we accept all his opinions as being valid and that you could rely on him and comfortably rely on him. So let's leave that question aside. If you assume that, so should you still read him? So I would ask yourself, well, assuming that you're a Yiddish reader, should you read Art Scroll? So if you think the answer is yes, I should read Art Scroll because I can't access it in the original. Then if you have Yiddish, so why not read Binyomin Slonik? This is a very important Rav who wrote an important sefer, and moreover, with a different approach. I do not sit and read Art Scroll books from cover to cover, but there's no attempt here to try to say anything about the beauty of observing the laws of Nida or how important it is to your relationship with anything else. he has an entirely different approach here. Now, you may not find his approach to be a palatable one, but his approach is it's heaven or hell. And if you don't observe these rules correctly, not only are you going to burn in hell, but your children are going to be malformed. Everyone's going to suffer. When you die, the worms are going to eat you and you're going to feel the pain of everything. Now, that doesn't, at least to the audience that I'm familiar with, that doesn't speak to everyone anymore, right? But I have to say that the idea of the beauty of the laws of mikvah doesn't speak to me at all. So it depends. It's a totally different approach. Would it be worthwhile reading? You'll learn a lot about Hilchot Nida, Chala, and Hadlakat Haner.
So I'll put a link in the show's notes again to your book. I'm not sure pricing and is it available. I'll try to find a link to this Zichron Aaron one that listeners can find. And I can link to your other book, as I mentioned, your newer book, which is relevant to this conversation, which is on the Marshal and the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch, Beis of Karo, but that is pricey. But I will link to it, and you can listen to the old podcast episode we did together. And thank you, Professor Fram, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to speak to you.